In this video, we'll talk about demand curve shifters. Now, when we talked about the demand curve in the previous video, we knew that that demand curve shows how price affects quantity demanded, other things being equal. Okay, now these other things are what cause the demand curve to actually shift, and we'll be talking more about this in this video. Now, I want you to remember that whenever price changes, okay, we are moving along the curve, okay? So let's say the price was P1, which was $8. For, let's say, we were talking about lattes earlier. Okay, and let's say the price fell to $4, okay? And so what's really going on here? If you think about this, at point A, when the price is $8, we're demanding less lattes. So let's say quantity demanded was 10 lattes, okay? But when the price is 4, maybe quantity demanded is higher, which is 20 lattes, okay? So as price fell, quantity demanded went up, okay? And this is the law of demand, everything else remaining the same. Now, remember to always distinguish between a movement along the curve, which is always caused by anything that's on the two axes, X or Y. So here, price is the variable. If price is changing, quantity demanded responds to that. And so you're moving from point A to point B, which is a movement along the curve, okay? But we could encounter situations where the curve shifts, okay? And we are going to be talking about that in a second and what factors influence that. But just to kind of put it out there, what we mean by shifts is, I'll take a different color and highlight this. So if we're thinking about the demand curve shifting, if there is an increase in demand, then we are saying the demand curve is shifting to the right. And so you can think about a shift from D1 to D2 is a shift of the curve, and there is an increase in demand. And what do we mean by that? We mean that if anything causes the demand curve to shift, and we'll talk about that very soon, but what this means is if the demand curve is shifting, that means that at any given price, let's say it's $8, now we are demanding more, okay? So earlier at the price point of $8, we were only demanding 10 lattes, okay? But as the demand curve shifts, at the price point of $8, we are demanding 20 lattes, okay? And much more at a price point of $4, okay? So that's the idea. And you can imagine that if we were experiencing a decrease in demand, that would have been a leftward shift of the demand curve. So let's make this D3. So if we went from D1 to D3, that is a decrease in demand. Okay, so now let's talk about when would the demand curve shift to the left or the right, or when would the demand increase or decrease. Okay, so here are all of the demand curve shifters that we will be discussing in this video. The first one being the number of buyers. So we'll talk about what happens if the number of buyers in the market increase and what happens when they decrease. We'll talk about income and two cases about normal and inferior goods. We'll talk about prices of related goods as being a factor that can shift demand, and tastes and preferences as another factor that can shift demand. And finally, expectations about the future, which could pertain to your income or future prices. Okay, so let's talk about the number of buyers first. Okay, so you can imagine if, can't remember what color I took, but here, let's think about the first part, which is, what if there is an increase in the number of buyers? An increase in the number of buyers would be represented by a shift from D1 to D2. So if you take any price point, let's pick this price. Let's say price equals $5. At $5, demand is determined on the original demand curve. It's as Q1. So on the original demand, curve, the demand is given by Q1, and on the new demand curve, which is D2, at a price of $5, right? We're talking about price of $5. What is quantity demanded? It's going to be something that's larger than Q1, okay? So it's going to be Q2. So Q2 is greater than Q1, right? And so if you would imagine, if there is an increase in the number of buyers in the market, then at each price there is going to be more demand, which is intuitive and which is also reflected on the graph. Okay, now you can think about the other scenario where there's a decrease in the number of buyers. The opposite would happen. We would move D1 to the left. Okay, so you would see a shift from D1 to D3, and that's a fall in demand. So at a price point of $5, we would now be demanding Q3, and Q3 is less than Q1. Okay, so what you need to do, and you want to practice this a lot, is always figure out or always think about what the factor is and what's really happening, what should happen. Write it down and then try to see if the graph tells you the same story. Okay, so let's move on to the next factor which can shift demand, which is income. So when we talk about income, we talk about two different cases. One is when we consider normal goods. Normal goods are goods that respond to the following change in income. If income increases, then the quantity demanded for those goods also goes up. Okay, so for instance, if your income went up and you were riding Muni, maybe you go and buy a car. Okay, so car becomes the normal good. As your income went up, car becomes the normal good. As your income went up, you demand, or there's a demand for cars. Okay, so if we were in the car market, right, what you would see is there is a shift from D1 to D2. Many other people like yourselves would also respond in similar ways. So let's say this is a Toyota Prius priced at $28,000. Then we are thinking about Q1 being the quantity demanded for cars under the original demand curve, and Q2 being the quantity demanded for cars when income has gone up. Okay, you can think about the opposite scenario. When income falls, then quantity demanded for normal goods would also fall. Okay, so they move in the same direction. That's what's important. Now, moving on to when we are talking about inferior goods are characterized by the following. If there is an increase in income, the quantity demanded for that good or service falls. Okay, so there is an inverse relationship. So you want to write this down. When we're thinking about normal goods, there's a positive relationship between income and quantity demanded. But when we are talking about inferior goods, there is a negative relationship between the two. Okay, so one example of inferior goods is or are bus rides. Okay, so maybe as your income goes up, you demand fewer bus rides. Okay, so what would happen as income goes up? You would see that if we were in the market for bus rides, the demand curve shifts to the left. And so at each price, let's say this was $2.50 or $2 for a bus ride. Earlier we were demanding much more, now we are demanding less. So that's as far as income goes. Now moving on to the prices of related goods. Okay, so again we'll consider two different cases. This is a factor that affects demand and causes a shift in the demand curve. So when we are talking about prices of related goods and we are talking about substitutes, then we might want to take an example. Okay, so substitutes would be like laptops and maybe those high-end tablets that almost work like computers. Okay, so it basically means they don't have to be perfect substitutes, but just substitutes where if there was a change in the price of one good, it would induce you to change your behavior in terms of quantity demanded of the other good. Okay, so let's think about laptops for a second. If laptops became more expensive, so if the price of laptops went up relative to the high-end tablets, so laptops are more expensive than high-end tablets. If that were to happen, you would switch to high-end tablets, and what would happen here? What you would see here would be, because high-end tablets are more in demand, the demand for laptops is going to fall. Okay, so this is really to, if you want to simplify this, you can say price of laptops went up a lot and high-end tablets they're cheaper. Right, and so you would see a fall in demand for laptops. Okay, and again, if you were thinking about high-end tablets and you were thinking about the demand for those, then the demand is going to go up for those. Okay, so quantity demanded for high-end laptops would go up and quantity demanded for laptops would fall. Okay, because of this price difference. Now we can think about another example, which is to do with complements. When you want to think about complements, you can think about computers and software. Okay, something that goes together. Okay, so it can be anything like college tuition and textbooks, bagels and cream cheese, eggs and bacon, lots of different things that you can think about. So computers and software is one example that we can roll with. Okay, so if the price of computers goes up, then you would expect that people will buy fewer computers and therefore less software. Okay, so if we were thinking about the demand for software, then we know that if price of computers is going up, then there is a fall in demand for softwares. The next factor is tastes and preferences. So this is less studied because it's very hard to determine people's tastes and preferences, but there are some interesting examples about this. So anything that causes a shift in tastes towards a good would increase the demand for a good. You can imagine that. So for example, in the 90s, the Atkins diet became very popular. And maybe right now, the keto diet is very popular. So what we see is with the Atkins diet, eggs became very popular. So we saw that there was an increase in demand for eggs because people prefer that all of a sudden, and that would shift the demand curve for eggs to the right. Okay, and for now, if you think about the ketogenic diet, then the demand for seafood is high, and that can make seafood more expensive because it would shift. I shouldn't say seafood more expensive because we'll get to that point later, but it would increase the demand for seafood. Okay, so you would see if you're inclined to consume a product, then at any given price point, you demand more of that. Okay, so whether it's eggs or seafood, that's what's happening. And finally, the expectations about the future. Okay, so one idea here would be what happens if your future income were to go up. So let's say you've got a job and your future income looks good. So if future income is rising, then you might actually increase your demand for anything today, anything that you like to consume. Okay, so quantity demanded increases today, and this is your current consumption. But if you expect future prices to go up, if you expect prices or goods to be more expensive in the future, then you also might want to increase your consumption today. You might want to demand more goods today. Okay, so future prices, like if you expect ice cream price or gas prices to go up tomorrow, maybe gas prices are a better example, and you own a car, then you would go and you would fill up your tank today. And for future income, you can really think about anything. Okay, so the most important thing to remember here, once we've covered all of these factors, is that the only determinant of quantity demanded that causes a movement along the curve is price. Okay, because price is one of the variables that's measured along the axis on the graph. So a handy rule of thumb is that you can use to remember whether it's a movement along the curve or a shift of the curve is if the variable causing the demand to change is measured on one of the axes, then you are moving along the curve. But if the variable that's causing demand to change does not appear on the axis, then the curve is going to shift. Okay, so remember that.